أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق نصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. O Allah, we ask you to send your blessings upon our Master Muhammad, the opener of what was closed and the seal of what came before him, champion of the truth, by the truth, and guide to the straight path, and upon his family and companions, as fitting his noble work. Ameen. Allahumma ya Kareem, akramna bi nur fahm, wa akhrajna min dhulumat al-wahm, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. O Allah, the noble, the generous, we ask you to ennoble us with the light of understanding, and to remove us from the shadows of illusion. And there is no power nor might except from God. We're going to be talking about money tonight, everyone's favorite. I like this topic a lot. Maybe it's not everyone's favorite topic. People like money, it's like fun. We're going to be talking about money. And this is like, remember, we're in the lifestyle chapter, so really we're going through topics that, when someone is embracing Islam or they are attempting to practice it more consciously in their lives, there's all of like the quote unquote religious matters that you need to learn about, such as like prayer, fasting, what the points of faith are. But then there are like the practical day-to-day matters. And we've gone through like relationships, sexuality and gender roles. We've gone now through, we go through the week before that. It all blurs together for me at the end of the year. We've gone through a few topics now. And so we all interact with money, is the point I guess I'm trying to make here. And because we all interact with money, there are things that we ought to understand about it and, do our best to be scrupulous in our dealings with money. So I want to begin tonight by talking about something that you've probably heard of before, and I would bet if you have heard about this topic, you have more questions about it because it's a hazy one, which is riba or use interest. What is it exactly according to the Sharia? How does the Sharia define it? And how does it really differ from the type of money that we have? Is it something that we can avoid today? And if so, how do we go about doing that? If not, what's kind of the compromise we have to reach? So we'll be talking about that. And then also, obviously, the way that Muslims interact with money is through giving charity. So we'll be talking a little bit about charity, both the obligatory form, which is the zakat, and supererogatory forms of charity, which we call sadaqah. But we'll begin with riba. And riba, actually, interestingly enough, it comes from the same root word as one of the names of Allah, which is Rabb. And this is kind of funny on the surface of it because Rabb is our Lord. And riba is something that is haram. So what's going on there? One of the sort of connotations of the word Rabb is that your Lord is the one who raises you up, meaning your Lord is your sustainer. He's the one who's taking care of you. And he causes you to grow and to evolve from one stage of your life into the next. Riba is referring to an increase. So it's that same concept of increase. We also have the word tarbiyah, which you may have heard, which means like to teach. It's teaching, it's rearing, it's instructing someone. You're raising someone up from a state of ignorance into a state of knowledge. or the state of being undisciplined into a state of being disciplined. Riba is referring to the same thing here. It is an increase of money, but a very specific form of increase in that money. It's the multiplication of money from money. And at its essence, this is what riba is. It is wealth begetting wealth. Meaning, I'm not earning money from any sort of service I am providing. I'm not earning money from any sort of product that I am selling. I'm earning money from the money that I already possess. That is a riba. And this is something that Allah says very, very categorically is absolutely haram. It's something we absolutely have to avoid, and we'll get into it more, but like Allah uses really, really strong language. We're going to talk about the reason for that. Like, why is it that this particular activity is extreme in the harm that it causes? Because anytime something is haram, we ought to understand that there is a harm that is being perpetrated. So to begin, the Prophet ﷺ said that profit, anytime you profit from something, it ought to be contingent upon liability. Meaning there has to be some risk when you profit from something. So like when you go and you buy and sell something in the marketplace, if you're selling a good, there is a lot of inherent risk to that activity. There is the risk that maybe nobody wants it, you'll be left with this product that you can't get rid of. There's a risk that your goods may be stolen, right? Even if you're profiting from like a wage earning job, there's always a risk that you could be laid off, someone more qualified may come into your position and take your job. There's risk involved. What we are talking about when we talk about riba is usually probably the most common form of riba is when you give out a loan. So let's say Jolin needs $10,000. He's got to pay for school, even though it's stressing you out right now. You got to pay for school, and you come to me and you say, I can't pay my tuition, can I borrow $10,000? And I say, sure, because I've got a ton of money and I just had $10,000 to lend out. I say, sure, but I'm going to charge you 4% a year. Let's go with 4%. So for every year that you still owe me this debt, I'm going to take 4% of that. It's 4% of $10,000. I think it's $400. So next year, this time, you're going to owe me $10,400. Did I get that right? Did I get that right? My PhD wasn't. So next year, this time, you'll owe me $10,400. If for some reason you can't pay after 2 years, you owe me like $10,800 and a little bit more, right? And that debt, that burden that you will owe is going to grow. And it's not just the principal, it is the interest that is placed upon that. That's the form of riba that most of us are familiar with. This is called riba nasiya. Riba nasiya. It is an additional amount paid upon the principal of the loan. The other type of riba, and this is where it's sort of like, I think the topic is interesting, at least to me. Has anyone seen The Big Short? Watch The Big Short. The Big Short is a great movie. It's got like Christian Bale in it, Brad Pitt. It's about the global financial crisis, like 2007, 2008, and how it happened. It's kind of like a documentary of sorts. It's a dramatized documentary. The global financial crisis kind of like it's a good example of why this next form of riba is included in the definition. This is called riba al-fadl, and it is excess compensation for the sale of a good. And there's a hadith that really explains what this type of riba is. The Prophet ﷺ said, sell gold in exchange of an equivalent amount of gold, silver in exchange of an equivalent amount of silver. Sell dates in exchange of an equivalent amount of dates. Sell wheat in exchange of an equivalent amount of wheat. Salt for salt, barley for barley, in equivalent amounts. But if a person transacts in excess, it will be riba. However, sell gold for silver, however you please, on the condition that it is hand to hand. And sell barley for dates any way you please, on the condition that it is hand to hand. Okay, so what does he say? Because this is kind of like confusing the first time you hear it. There is another hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ sees Bilal, one of his companions. And Bilal is walking with a bushel of dates, and he has a smile upon his face. And the Prophet sees him, he strikes up a conversation, like, where are you going? And he says, well, I just traded these dates for a bushel of dates that I have, but I like these dates better, right? So I traded like 2 kilograms, I'm just making these numbers up, 2 kilograms of the dates that I had for this 1 kilogram of dates. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Bilal, this is the very essence of riba. Because you traded dates for dates, but you exchanged 2 of your kilograms for 1 kilogram that the person, that the other person. So this is why he says, trade a like amount of dates for a like amount of dates. Any excess, like trading 2 kilograms for 1 kilogram, is riba. If Bilal had wanted to do that transaction in a manner that would have been permissible, what he ought to have done is to have gone and sold those dates for some gold. And then taken the gold and exchanged that gold for the dates that he wanted. That would have made that transaction permissible. And the first time I read this, and in fact, the first couple of times I taught this particular class, I did not understand why this was haram. It's like, what's the big deal? Someone has dates that you prefer, like you have Majjul dates and I have Medina dates. And clearly, I mean, I don't know about you, but I think Majjuls are right like that. But I've got 2 kilograms of Medina dates, and you've got 1 kilogram of Majjuls. And I'm like, do you want to trade? And you're like, yeah, sounds good to me. I prefer Medinas anyway. You got 2 kilograms. I'll trade you for my 1 kilogram of vegetables. What's wrong with it? What is wrong with that? The global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 explains exactly what is wrong with that. And really what this is doing is it is cutting off a lot of the financial shenanigans that led to that financial collapse. Where you guys are familiar with this, right? What happened in 2007, 2008? People lost their homes. People, like who were about to retire, lost their 401ks. They had to continue working for another decade. Like people of our generation. I graduated college in 2007. And we graduated into probably the worst economy decades. And a lot of people from my generation couldn't get jobs. Like it just wreaked a lot of havoc. It absolutely destroyed the economy. And so what happened? Like what actually caused all of it? Well, again, if you watch the Big Short, you'll understand this on like actually a pretty deep level because it does a good job explaining it. But what was involved, what ultimately led to this was this type of exchange of money for money, rather than like dates for dates. It was money for money in unequal amounts. So what people would do is they would get, remember it was a housing collapse. they would get a bunch of mortgages, package them together, and let's say I have a package of $1 billion worth of mortgages. And the interest on these mortgages in 20 years will be worth $2 billion. So I own these mortgages. And I go to Jolin and I'm like, hey, in 20 years, these mortgages are going to be worth $2 billion. Right now, they're worth $1 billion. I will sell this package of mortgages. It's called a collateralized debt obligation, CDO. I'll sell this to you for $1.3 billion. And then all you have to do is wait 20 years and you'll have $2 billion. You're going to net $700 million. And you're like, that sounds great. That's easy money. That is money that I don't have to do anything to earn. It's risk-free. Everyone thought this was risk-free because the price of houses historically had only gone up. You say, great, let's do it. So I am immediately generating for $1 billion. I'm immediately getting $1.3 billion. It's an unequal amount of money that I'm exchanging. You guys following me so far? Okay, good. So for $1 billion, I get $1.3 billion. I make $300 million out of nothing. And this is why this is considered to be riba, because that money, that $1 billion that I have, generates $300 million out of nothing. Now, in order to do something like this, I have to get a lot of people to take mortgages. And I have to sell mortgages to people who really can't afford it. What this does is it incentivizes financial transactions that are unstable, because you have to get people to buy these mortgages. And I'm incentivized not only to sell these mortgages to people who cannot afford it, but with a lot of the other financial instruments that are out there, I can take out insurance because I know that these contracts will fail eventually. And I can basically bet on them failing. So I make even more money. This is what riba al-fadl is about. When you are allowed to exchange unequal amounts of the same commodity good for each other, you can create these really complex, I know this it's a little confusing. You can create these complex financial instruments that completely wreck economies, where you have trillions of dollars that just vanished overnight in the global financial crisis. This is what the prohibition on riba al-fadl is cutting off at its source. If you can't do this, you don't have these big financial systems that just collapse upon themselves. Right? And therefore, you don't have people who can cover their debts. You don't have people who do their 401ks. You don't have people who graduate into wrecked economies. There's a lot of pain that gets involved. And remember, everything about the Sharia is about accruing benefit and averting harm. So those are the two types of riba that are forbidden. And by the way, Muslims are not unique in saying that usury is harmful and it ought to be avoided. Up until very recently, this is something that both Christians and Jews agreed is absolutely impermissible. It is not something that you can do because it creates a lot of financial ills. This was common knowledge for centuries that this is something that leads people into impoverishment. You guys ever watched The Sopranos? Yeah. I rewatched The Sopranos somewhat recently. I watched it back in the day. It was on TV. And I rewatched it. And there was a scene where Tony, he's running this illegal gambling. Talk about The Sopranos. Tony's running this poker match that he's inviting all these people to. And there's a family friend who hears about it who has a gambling problem. And he kind of like works his way into this game, and he keeps losing. And he goes to Tony, and he's like, "Can you spot some extra money so I can continue playing this game?" And at first, Tony is like, "No, I think you should like sit it out." And the guy's like, "I'll pay you 3 points on the money you won." Meaning, like, that's the interest that I would pay you. And you can like see it in Tony's eyes, like, this is like, it's gonna be awesome. He's not gonna be able to pay this. And so he said, "Okay, here's the money." So this guy can't pay his debts. Tony ends up like taking his business from him, like basically selling off all of his assets so that he can repay his debts. And the guy asked him, "Why did you let me take the money? You knew this would happen. Why did you let me take the money?" And Tony says, "This is my bread and butter. Like, this is what I do. Like, this is how I make money." And what is very clear is that Tony knew that this was going to harm the man who was taking the money. And so the incentive was not aligned between Tony and this man. Meaning, Tony knew that he would only profit if this man fell into some sort of financial harm. And this, whether you're talking about like a person-to-person loan or like entire financial systems that are constructed upon usury and debt, that this is a misaligned incentive that gets set up, where the people loaning the money do better when the people taking the loan fail. And so more often than not, what you will have is you will have explicit attempts to create that type of failure so that the people lending the money will profit greater than they would have if you just pay off the loan. This is true of like credit cards. Credit cards love it when like, you don't make your payments. This is true wherever you find this sort of financial issue of lending money at interest. So it leads people into a state of not only impoverishment, but of, I don't want to say the word slavery, right? Because that's a heavy word, but having their life controlled by the people that they lend money to. Right? So this is why Allah condemns the riba in a way that He does not condemn other things. He says, "O you who believe," this is in chapter 2 or book 2 of the Quran. "O you who believe, fear Allah and give up what remains due to you of interest, riba, if you are believers. And if you do not, then be informed of a war against you from Allah and His Messenger." Allah says, "I declare war upon the person who lends money at interest." He doesn't say this about anything else. He doesn't say this about drinking alcohol. He doesn't say this about fornication. He doesn't say this about murder. But he says this about riba. Because economies that are based upon this, people who loan money at interest, themselves have declared war. In effect, this is what God is saying. When you lend money at interest, you are declaring war upon the money or upon the people that you lend money to. So this is somewhat frightening because it is something that today I believe we can't escape. We can't escape interest. Even if, like, let's say you pay for your car in cash, you're going to pay for your home in cash. Even the money that we use is based upon the riba. You guys know why? What backs our money? Does anyone know? Gold. Seems like gold. That was true until 1971. President Nixon took us off the gold standard. Yep. That is true. The military. Faith? Yeah. Well, that's a good answer, because when like a politician, for example, gets asked what backs the dollar, the standard answer that you would hear is the full faith and credit of the American government. And what is backing up the credit of the American government? It's our military. It's our ability to basically enforce our movement, which is quickly crumbling. But up until very recently, it was full faith and credit of the U.S. government backed by the military. Nothing backs our money. Our money is debt-based. That's how money gets created, is when debt is created. And that's kind of an interesting story as to how that works. Maybe we can go into that if anyone's interested. But our money is debt, and debt earns interest in our economy. So when you use a dollar, what you're doing is you're saying, this dollar is representative of the debt that is owed to me. When I pay you the dollar for this service that you're rendering me, I'm giving you the right to that debt. It's not an asset. Our money is not an asset. It's not gold backed. It's not representing like a piece of gold that we can redeem the dollar. Not since 1970. So we have reached a time where I believe, the Prophet described it. The Prophet described, I believe, the time that we are in. He said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, a time will come upon the people in which they will consume usury. And it was said, all of the people? And the Prophet said, whoever does not consume it will be affected by its dust. Meaning, maybe you buy even your really expensive purchases like your house. Maybe you pay for your house in cash. No one does that, by the way. But maybe you're like, I'm going to be really scrupulous about this, and I'm going to save up $800,000 for a house and just pay it in cash. Well, the cash that you're paying it with is a debt-based instrument that earns interest. So even if you do not engage in usury, the dust of usury is touching you. It has reached you. This is what the Prophet ﷺ is describing. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, we do our best. As with any situation like this, right? We understand these things so that we know what the ideal is. And I think this is really important. Like, this isn't just like to be fluffy about this topic and say, well, there's nothing we can do, so just proceed as normal. Like, no, understand that you are living under a financial regime that is fundamentally unjust. Understand that, right? And the Prophet ﷺ gave us instruction on what to do when we cannot change something like this. He said, when you see a wrong, change it with your hand. Meaning, like, physically stop harm from being done. And if you can't, then change it with your tongue, meaning speak out against it. And if you can't do that, then hate it in your heart. So, we're at a point where, if nothing else, we can understand that this economy, this financial system, is unjust. It does harm people. And and at the very least, for that reason, we dislike it in our heart. And we don't give our sort of moral assent to it. We don't condone it. We don't cherish it. We don't try to benefit from it, but we benefit to the extent that we have to. Geopolitically, I think we're somewhat insulated in the US, but economically, this whole, like I said, like after 1971, we went off the gold standard, where that gave the central banks of the world, because prior to 1971, the US was on the gold standard. And pretty much every other nation in the world had their currency pegged to the dollar. So most of the world was by default zero connected to the dollar was connected to the dollar. When we went off of that, central banks were able to just print money at will. And like, this isn't even riba necessarily. This is like a step beyond riba, where you're not even creating money from like loans that you give out at interest. You just create money at will. And, you know, because of COVID, remember they started like sending out checks. This started with 2007, 2008, the global financial crisis. Remember TARP? Is anyone here old enough to remember TARP? Where they printed a bunch of money and they gave it to the banks to bail them out, right? And that was like in the billions of dollars. That was the scandal. It's like, how can you just print billions of dollars? In 2020, we printed trillions of dollars. In fact, close to 40% of all of the US dollars in existence today have been printed since 2020. And the effect of that is starting to sort of hit our economy, meaning like the inflation, because that is monetary inflation. You increase the money supply. That is starting to really affect the economy. And so the Fed has been raising, in response, they've been raising interest rates to try to bring the inflation down. But that's been killing the stock market. Anyway, point being, when you start going down this path, you inherently create instability. And so a lot of economists are starting to say, we're about to go through something that will be worse than the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008. So, I mean, this is a particularly pertinent class because like, this is something that could literally blow up any day. So it's a pertinent class because it's directly relevant to things that are happening in current events. You will see what Allah says about riba. He said, "Yamhaq Allahu riba wa yarbi sadaqat." Meaning Allah will create, He will cause riba to vanish. He will cause it to just disappear. Just disappear. And this is what happens when these financial systems collapse. Wealth just disappears. That's the question. Yeah, that's the question. Like what comes to replace it? It's a good question. What would happen? I mean, there has never been the money we have, like, since it's not backed by anything, it's called fiat money, which means it's money by government mandate. The world has never lived in a fiat economy, historically speaking. It's only about 50 years old, since 1971. So we don't know what happens when the fiat economy crashes. What comes after that? We have no experience really to say. So we don't know, but we will find out. I mean, we will see the effects, and I think we will see. If you want to talk about the wisdom of this prohibition, you will see the truth of Allah's statement that He will cause this to vanish. This happened in 2007. Like billions of dollars just disappeared overnight. Just completely disappeared. But He says He will cause charity to increase. Charity is something that will remain. Like when you give, that creates real wealth. And that is something that will last. It's actually much stronger at its foundation than this type of monetary transaction. The social effects of riba. This was an observation by Ibn al-Badawi. He said that on a societal level, when an economy collapses, and not just because of riba, but for any reason, when an economy collapses, the rich become richer and the poor become poorer, which is something that we have seen over recent years. Like the middle class is very much started to collapse in this country. The rich become prone to fornication, alcohol, and corruption. And the poor dwell in their sorrows in those very same sins. The rich because of access, and the poor because of sorrow. And look around the US and see the truth of these statements. Like middle America has been hollowed out by a meth crisis and by a prescription drug crisis. Because they call these, when people overdose, they die of these. They've started to refer to this as like a death of despair. Because people, their economic position in life has just collapsed, and that's why they turn to these. The people who are incredibly wealthy, they do these things because, well, they have access to them. And the sorrow because they have no other option, they have nowhere else to turn. Okay, so that's riba. What does Allah offer as an alternative to that? Well, this will sound counterintuitive, I think, to most of us. Because of the type of economy that we've grown up in, because of how we tend to think about money, this will sound counterintuitive. But what is the alternative to interest? It's charity. It's charity. And there is both a practical and a metaphysical aspect to this. When Allah says that He will cause charity to increase, whereas He will cause interest to vanish. And this is where we get into zakat and like really the wisdom behind zakat. We're not going to talk too much about like the fiqh of zakat. The fiqh of zakat is you pay 2.5% of your saved wealth over the past year. So any money that you have, like, let's say, had in your savings account for more than 1 year, you pay 2.5% of that. You give it out, share it. That's the fiqh. And if you don't have saved wealth or you don't have a sufficient amount of saved wealth, then you don't have to pay zakat. In fact, you're eligible to receive it. But the wisdom of zakat is that it actually creates financial stability. Rather than loaning money out at interest and making money off of your money and putting people in a position where they don't pay, they just dig themselves deeper into a hole. You give that freely. It's theirs. The way that you pay zakat, and ideally the way that you give sadaqah, which is like voluntary zakat, is you give it to the people who are closest to you. And so what does that do? You, like within your family, if anyone needs money, you can give them your zakat. Like my brother, let's say, needs to pay off a loan, or he is like, let's say, incarcerated, zakat money can be used to get people out of jail. I can give him my zakat money, and that puts him on a stable financial footing. Eventually, my family is financially stable, which means my family is earning more money, and I now have an entire family that can give zakat, assuming my family exists, which they're not. This is a thought experiment. Now my family is giving zakat, so we start giving zakat out to our neighbors. Okay, what happens then? Eventually, your neighborhood is financially stable. Your neighborhood is generating income and it's saving money. And they start giving money to people that are close to them. Zakat sort of like has this, you've heard of trickle-down economics? It's like real trickle-down economics. You actually create financial stability progressively over time. in a way that is sustaining, in a way that actually helps people. And sort of the mental shift that we have to make to really understand what the Sharia is asking of us in these scenarios is that loans, even if we're not talking about charity, money that's just given, even if I'm going to loan Jolyn that $10,000, that is understood to be an act of charity because I'm not asking for interest on that. I'm doing it solely for Jolyn's benefit, not for my benefit. I'm not going to make anything. But Jolyn is a guy in my community. I know him. He's a friend. I create a little bit more stability here in this community at Ta'leef in doing this. Jolyn, because he can go to school, he can get a job. And then maybe, hey, he can be a donor at Ta'leef. Right? That is how Allah increases wealth through charity. So we take loans and we move it from this category of financial gain, monetary instrument for making money, to the category of charity. And it actually creates the wealth that you were seeking to get through riba in the first place. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا